My name's Liam. I'm 28, and for as long as I can remember, I've carried a quiet label in my family: the failure. It wasn't always said outright, not at first, but it lived in the smirks at family dinners, the whispers I'd overhear when they thought I wasn't listening, and the way relatives would nod a little too politely when I talked about my plans. I grew up in a family where appearances meant everything. Success wasn't measured by happiness or fulfillment. It was measured by how much money you made, how impressive your job title sounded, and how proudly your parents could brag about you in front of others. And in their eyes, I always fell short. At school, I was never the star athlete like my cousin. I wasn't the straight A scholar my older brother was. I wasn't the musical prodigy my sister was praised for being. I was the kid who stayed up late tinkering with computers, sketching out strange ideas in notebooks, trying to imagine things that didn't exist yet. To me, it felt like exploration. To my family, it looked like wasted time. The breaking point, though, the moment that truly branded me in their minds, happened at my grandmother's funeral. I was 24 at the time. Grief already sat heavy on my chest because she was the one person who'd believed in me unconditionally. She'd slip me small amounts of money when I was broke, whisper encouragement when the others laughed, and tell me she saw something in me no one else seemed to. At her funeral, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd get a chance to stand up and speak about her, to tell everyone what she meant to me. But as I rose to my feet, my uncle, my father's older brother, pulled me aside with a grip that felt more like a clamp than a hand. He leaned in, his breath sharp with coffee and cigarettes, and whispered the words that I can still hear as if they were carved into my brain. "You'll always be the family failure. Don't embarrass us by speaking." I froze. My mouth went dry, my palms sweaty. I wanted to argue, to shove him back, to shout in his face that he had no right to decide what I could or couldn't say about my own grandmother. But instead, I swallowed it. I sat back down, my legs trembling, and watched as others, people who hadn't visited her in years, stood and delivered shallow speeches. My throat ached with the words I never spoke. That day marked me. The anger, the humiliation, the sting of being silenced at a moment when my voice mattered most, it stayed with me. On the drive home, I stared out the window while my parents made small talk in the front seat. They didn't ask me why I hadn't spoken. They didn't notice the storm boiling inside me. To them, I'd simply played my role, the quiet, invisible disappointment. But here's the thing, I didn't forget. I let their words fuel me, while they continued their lives, comfortable in their smug certainty that Liam would never amount to anything. I threw myself into the only thing that ever made me feel alive, building something of my own. I worked brutal hours, sleeping on an air mattress in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and broken heat. I ate ramen more times than I care to admit. Friends drifted away because I was always too busy, but I kept going. Every failure, every rejection, every sneer from family members at holiday dinners, it all added fuel. Still, those dinners were brutal. I remember one Thanksgiving not long after the funeral. I walked in late because I'd been on a call with a potential investor. As I sat down, my uncle chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. "So, Liam, still chasing your little projects? When are you going to get a real job?" My cousin snickered. My parents said nothing. I wanted to throw my fork across the table, but instead I forced a smile and muttered something about working on it. Each gathering seemed to blend into the next. Always the same questions, the same digs, the same suffocating feeling that no matter what I did, they had already decided who I was. My uncle, especially, seemed to delight in it. He'd slap me on the back a little too hard, laugh at my clothes, question if I was still broke. And I endured it. I bit my tongue until it bled because I had something he didn't know. I had a plan. And then, 2 years later, everything changed. My startup, the one they had dismissed as a hobby, was acquired. Not for a small sum, not for some token payout, but for $6.1 million. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, staring at the contract, and feeling a wave of disbelief wash over me. It was real. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the disappointment. I had built something, and someone had seen the value in it. For a while, I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to sit with it quietly, to savor the victory that no one thought I was capable of. I upgraded my apartment. I bought myself a car that didn't rattle when it hit 60. I finally breathed without the weight of constant financial anxiety pressing down on me. And then he showed up. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, So when I opened it and saw my uncle standing there, dressed in a too-tight polo, his smile wide but not reaching his eyes, I felt my stomach drop. He reached out his hand, all friendly, like we were old buddies. "Liam, my boy," he said, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "I heard the good news. Thought I'd come by, congratulate you." I stood frozen, the memory of his whisper at the funeral roaring back in my mind. His grip on my arm. His words, "Failure. Don't embarrass us." And now, here he was, smiling like none of it had ever happened, as if he hadn't spent years cutting me down in front of anyone who would listen. I didn't shake his hand. I didn't move. I just stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Because in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. When I didn't take his hand, my uncle let out this awkward little laugh, like he could just brush off my hesitation. He dropped his arm back to his side and craned his neck past me, peering into my apartment as if he had every right to. I stepped sideways to block his view, but he was already sizing up the furniture, the framed prints on the walls, the upgraded kitchen appliances. His smile widened, though his eyes darted with calculation, not joy. "Looks like things are going well for you," he said, his tone carefully casual. "Real well." I didn't invite him in, but he invited himself. He brushed past me with a pat on my shoulder, walking straight into my living room and sitting down on the couch like he owned the place. My jaw tightened, but I closed the door behind him, partly because I didn't want the neighbors hearing whatever was about to unfold. "So, Liam," he began, leaning back with his arms stretched along the cushions. "6 million, huh? That's incredible. Who would have thought? All those late nights on the computer finally paid off." He chuckled, shaking his head as if it were some amusing miracle rather than the product of years of my sweat and sacrifice. I forced myself to sit in the armchair opposite him. "Yeah, it's been a long road," I said, careful to keep my voice steady. He nodded, then leaned forward, clasping his hands together like he was about to offer me sage wisdom. "You know, the family's proud of you. Really, we always knew you had potential. Took you long enough, but you finally proved us right." Those words burned. I clenched my fists under the armrest. He wasn't saying I had proved myself. He was saying I had finally lived up to their expectations. Expectations they had never actually believed I could meet. It was as if all the years of mockery and dismissal had been erased, rewritten in his mind as tough love that had motivated me. Then he got to the point. "Listen, Liam," he said, lowering his voice slightly, as though confiding in me. "Your cousin Ryan is starting college soon. And, well, tuition isn't cheap. He's a smart kid, bright future. You'd be doing the family proud if you helped out a little. Think of it as an investment in the next generation." There it was. The first ask. My stomach turned, but I kept my expression neutral. "College is expensive," I said flatly. "I'm sure Ryan will figure it out." His smile faltered, just for a second, then returned. Of course. But you know, family helps family. And let's be honest, you can afford it now. It's not like it'd hurt you." I didn't answer. I just let the silence stretch, the ticking of the clock on the wall filling the space. He shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on. "You've got to understand," he continued, his tone sharpening. "Your success reflects on all of us. When people hear you sold a company for millions, they don't just see you, they see the family name. That kind of success should benefit everyone." There it was again, the same old narrative. My accomplishments weren't mine. They belonged to the family. The same family that had called me a failure, mocked me at every holiday, silenced me at my grandmother's funeral. Now they wanted to cash in. The weeks that followed only made things worse. Word of my success spread faster than I ever imagined. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered my phone number. I got texts that started with thinly veiled congratulations and ended with requests for loans or investments. My aunt left me a voicemail about how her roof needed replacing and how it would mean the world if I could help. A cousin emailed me a link to a used car he wanted, attaching the price tag as if I'd just wire the money without question. At family dinners, the dynamic shifted entirely. Instead of mocking me, they paraded me like a trophy. "This is Liam," my uncle boasted one night at Thanksgiving. "He's the genius who made millions before 30. He said it with pride, but his eyes flicked toward me with that same cold calculation. He wasn't proud of me. He was proud of what he thought he could extract from me. They sat me at the head of the table that year, a place usually reserved for my uncle. It wasn't respect, it was strategy. I was a resource now. The golden goose. My opinions suddenly mattered, but only if they served their interests. When I didn't volunteer to pay for the entire holiday spread, I noticed the whispers, the shared looks. The same condescending tone slipped back into my uncle's voice as he toasted to generosity, making sure his glass clinked against mine with deliberate emphasis. Every time I tried to talk about my life outside of money, about the actual work I'd done, the risks, the failures, the moments that had shaped me, they changed the subject back to what I could give them. To them, I wasn't Liam anymore. I was a bank account in human form. The final straw of that season came one evening when I got home to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a letter written in my uncle's handwriting. It wasn't even disguised as a request, it was a list. Items, amounts, and names of relatives, as though I were some kind of family treasurer. At the bottom, underlined twice, was a note. We're counting on you. Don't let us down. My chest tightened with a mix of rage and disbelief. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter for a long time, my pulse thundering in my ears. All the years of being silenced, mocked, dismissed, suddenly it felt like they were back, just wearing a different mask. I wasn't the failure anymore, but to them, I still wasn't a person. I crumpled the letter in my fist, my knuckles white. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself think it. Maybe it was time to stop swallowing my words. The letter should have been the peak of it, the outrageous demand that opened my eyes completely. But as it turned out, that was only the warm-up. The real betrayal was waiting, biding its time until it could crash through my door in a way that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be written off as just family being family. It came 3 months later. By then, the calls and texts had slowed, though not out of respect. I'd stopped answering most of them, choosing silence over endless manipulation. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd take the hint and back off. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I got a call from my bank. The voice on the other end was professional but edged with unease. "Mr. Taylor," the woman said, "we just wanted to confirm a transfer request that came through your account this morning. It's a fairly large sum, and given the recipient's details, our fraud detection system flagged it." My stomach dropped. "What transfer?" I asked. She read off the amount, $45,000. And the recipient? My cousin Ryan. My throat went dry. "I didn't authorize that," I said firmly. The woman hesitated. "That's what we suspected. But the request was unusual. It came with a notarized document attached, apparently signed by you, granting your uncle, Charles Taylor, limited authority over certain transactions." I felt the blood drain from my face. My uncle, my own flesh and blood, had forged documents to access my money. I asked the bank to email me copies of everything, and when the files hit my inbox minutes later, I stared at the PDF, my chest tight. There it was, my name, my signature, clumsily imitated, not even close to the way I actually signed. And beneath it, legal-looking language that clearly gave my uncle the right to allocate resources for family obligations. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was theft, deliberate, calculated. He had taken his entitled narrative, that my money belonged to the family, and pushed it to its logical extreme. I called him immediately, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. He picked up on the third ring, his voice sickeningly cheerful. "Liam, good to hear from you, son. How's everything going?" "You forged my signature," I said flatly, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. There was a pause. Then he sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Now, don't be dramatic. It was just paperwork. I figured you wouldn't mind, not with all that money sitting there. 45,000 is nothing to you now, Liam. Nothing. And Ryan needs it. He's the future of this family." My vision blurred with rage. "You had no right," I spat. "No right to touch a cent of mine." "You're missing the point," he snapped back, his mask slipping. "Everything you have, it reflects on all of us. You think you did this alone? You think without this family you'd be anywhere? You should be grateful. And if you won't help willingly, then sometimes family has to make those decisions for you." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. My whole body was trembling, adrenaline surging. I sat there in the dim light of my living room, the betrayal hitting me in waves. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. About erasing my independence, my autonomy, my identity, just as he had tried to do at my grandmother's funeral when he silenced me. Back then, it was my voice. Now it was my success. The next day, I went to see my parents, hoping for some kind of support. But when I explained what had happened, my father rubbed his temple and said, "Maybe you should have just given him the money, Liam. It would have avoided all this trouble." My mother nodded, adding, "He's your uncle. He's done a lot for this family. You should try to understand where he's coming from." I stared at them in disbelief, my chest aching. "He forged my signature. He tried to steal from me," I said, my voice rising. But they just sat there, silent, as if that detail didn't matter. As if I was the one making things complicated. That was the moment something broke inside me. The realization that not only had my uncle betrayed me, but my own parents would stand behind him, rationalizing his theft as family duty. It was like the ground had opened beneath me, exposing just how alone I really was in this web of blood ties and obligations. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every insult, every dismissal, every time they'd laughed at me across a dinner table. I thought of my grandmother, the only one who had believed in me, and how furious she would have been if she knew what they had done. My jaw ached from clenching it so hard. And then, slowly, my rage started to crystallize into something else. A cold, deliberate clarity. I knew I couldn't keep swallowing my words. I knew I couldn't let this betrayal stand. But I also knew I couldn't lash out blindly. If I was going to respond, it had to be careful, precise, something that would finally shatter the smug certainty with which they treated me as both failure and resource. Because this wasn't just about money. This was war. The weeks after discovering the forged signature were some of the hardest of my life. On the surface, I had everything I once dreamed of: financial freedom, independence, the ability to finally live on my own terms. But inside, I felt like the walls were closing in. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was the silence that followed. My uncle carried on as though nothing had happened. My parents, instead of standing by me, treated my anger as an overreaction. And the rest of the family? They either avoided the subject or acted like I was being selfish for not sharing. The bank froze the fraudulent transfer, thankfully. They assured me that my uncle hadn't gotten a penny, but that did little to ease the sting. I had to meet with lawyers, sign affidavits, and prove my own identity against the false one he'd created. Sitting across from professionals in crisp suits, explaining how my own uncle had tried to steal from me, was humiliating in a way I can't quite describe. Every time I spoke the words out loud, he forged my signature. It felt like I was confessing a weakness, a shame that somehow belonged to me instead of him. I started avoiding family gatherings entirely. The thought of sitting at the same table with people who would justify theft as family obligation was unbearable. Invitations piled up in my inbox: holiday dinners, birthdays, barbecues. I deleted them without responding. One day my mother called, her voice sharp. "Liam, you can't just cut everyone off. People are starting to talk. It looks bad when you act this way." I bit my tongue, because what I wanted to say was, "It looked bad when your brother tried to steal from me, too." Instead, I just muttered something about being busy and ended the call quickly. Isolation became my default. Friends had drifted away during the years I'd built my startup, and now, with my family siding against me, I had no one left to lean on. Nights blurred together, me sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights outside my window, the silence pressing down like a weight. I had the money to fill the void with distractions, luxury vacations, expensive toys, but none of it appealed to me. What was the point if the people closest to me saw me as nothing but a wallet? Sleep didn't come easily. Most nights, I lay awake replaying the funeral in my head, the moment my uncle silenced me, the way his hand gripped my arm. "You'll always be the family failure." The words had been a curse, a brand burned into my identity. And now, even with millions in the bank, I felt like he'd found a way to brand me again, not as a failure this time, but as a resource to be controlled, harvested, drained. The lowest point came one Sunday afternoon when I decided, against my better judgment, to drive out to my parents' house. A part of me still hoped for reconciliation. Maybe if I explained it in person, maybe if I looked them in the eyes, they would finally see. When I walked through the front door, though, my uncle was already there, sitting comfortably on the couch, sipping coffee from a mug like he owned the place. My father barely looked up from the newspaper as he said, "Good, you're here. We were just talking about you." My uncle smiled that same oily smile and gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down, Liam. We need to clear the air. Against my instincts, I sat. My mother brought me a cup of coffee, as if that simple gesture could smooth over weeks of silence and betrayal. My uncle leaned forward. I know you were upset about the bank thing, he began, his tone patronizing. But you've got to understand, I was just looking out for the family. You've got more than you need, Liam. Don't you think it's time to give back? I stared at him, too stunned to speak. He didn't even deny it. He admitted to forging my name like it was nothing, like it was some minor misunderstanding rather than a crime. And worse, my parents sat there nodding, not horrified, not outraged, just complicit. Something inside me cracked then. I realized no apology was ever coming, no acknowledgement of the wrong they'd done. To them, I would always be either the failure or the resource, never the person, never the son. I left without touching the coffee, without saying goodbye. I got in my car and drove until the houses thinned out into empty roads, the fields stretching on either side. My chest felt hollow, my hands numb on the steering wheel. For the first time in years, I cried. Rage, grief, exhaustion spilling out until I had to pull over just to breathe. That night, sitting in my apartment with swollen eyes and a raw throat, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wasn't going to keep playing the role they had written for me. If I stayed silent, if I kept letting them push me down, then they would win. And I couldn't let that happen, not again. But I also knew I couldn't strike back impulsively. Not yet. They were too comfortable, too sure of themselves. If I lashed out now, they'd just twist it into more proof that I was difficult, ungrateful, the problem. No, my revenge had to be careful, methodical. I had to let them walk deeper into their own arrogance until the floor dropped out from under them. So I waited. I watched. And for the first time in my life, I stopped caring about their approval. After that night, something shifted in me. The grief and exhaustion that had nearly broken me gave way to a steadier, colder kind of energy. I stopped waiting for their validation, stopped hoping for some grand moment of reconciliation that would never come. Instead, I turned inward and asked myself a question I'd never really considered before. If their approval doesn't matter, what would I do with my life purely for me? The answer surprised me. I poured myself back into work, but this time, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It wasn't about chasing some abstract victory over the voices that had always called me a failure. It was about building something sustainable, something meaningful. I partnered with a few trusted colleagues I'd met during the startup days, people who had believed in my ideas before they were worth millions. We started developing new projects, investing in smaller companies with potential. Slowly, I realized I wasn't just a one-hit wonder. I had a knack for seeing possibilities where others didn't. The more I leaned into that, the more doors opened. By the time I turned 29, I had stakes in 3 growing businesses. One was an app that streamlined medical scheduling, another a green energy startup, and the third a niche logistics platform. Each required long hours and careful risk-taking, but the payoff wasn't just financial, it was personal. I was finally surrounding myself with people who valued my input, not my wallet. And as my success grew, so did my freedom. I bought a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, away from the noise of the city. I traveled, not for luxury, but for perspective. Standing in the crowded markets of Marrakesh, walking along the cliffs in Ireland, hiking through forests in Japan, I felt alive in a way I never had before. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving or proving myself. I was living. But while I was building myself up, my family kept circling. The calls never fully stopped, though I ignored most of them. When I did pick up, usually by accident, it was always the same script. Your cousin needs help with tuition. Your aunt's medical bills are piling up. We were thinking of starting a family business, and you could really make it happen. Each time, I shut it down with polite vagueness, careful not to give them anything solid. Still, I could sense their growing frustration. Without access to me, their plans dried up. My uncle, especially, grew bolder in his attempts to insert himself into my life. He showed up uninvited once more, this time at a restaurant where I was meeting an investor. He acted as though he had been involved in my success from the beginning, trying to leverage my credibility to impress the man across the table. I had to excuse myself and pull my uncle aside, hissing through clenched teeth that if he ever did that again, he'd regret it. He just smirked, like he knew he still had time to wear me down. But what he didn't know was that while he was circling me, I was quietly circling back. With every business deal I closed, with every step forward I took, I wasn't just growing wealth, I was building influence. I began donating to organizations my family had ties to, but always anonymously. I supported scholarships at the very universities my cousins hoped to attend. I gained quiet connections with people in the community, lawyers, business leaders, even a few in politics. It wasn't about flaunting anything. It was about planting seeds. The turning point came one evening at a networking event. A man approached me, introducing himself as a financial advisor who had once worked with my uncle. He spoke casually, but his words carried weight. "Charles has been overextending himself," he said, referring to my uncle. "A few risky investments, some debts he hasn't exactly been upfront about. Just thought you should know." I tucked that information away, careful not to show how much it lit a spark inside me. My uncle, so smug, so sure of his own control, was overreaching. He had cracks in his armor. And while I was building strength quietly, he was growing reckless loudly. That imbalance was everything I needed. By the time I turned 30, the contrast was undeniable. I was thriving, financially, emotionally, socially. My network was strong, my projects successful, and my confidence steady. My uncle, meanwhile, was still trying to bully and manipulate his way into relevance, unaware that his foundation was crumbling. The irony wasn't lost on me. At my grandmother's funeral, he had silenced me, branding me the family failure. Now, years later, I had more power than he could ever imagine. And he was the one stumbling, desperate, needing what I had. I didn't confront him, not yet. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about striking the moment you were angry. It was about waiting until the ground beneath your enemy was already soft, then applying just the right amount of pressure to make it collapse. And when the moment came, I would be ready. The opportunity presented itself almost too perfectly, as though fate had been biding its time, watching me gather strength before finally laying the next card on the table. By now, my life had taken on a rhythm that felt steady and controlled. I was no longer scrambling, no longer reacting to the chaos my family stirred up. I was observing, waiting, preparing. It started with a call from a former classmate, Daniel, who had become an attorney specializing in corporate fraud and estate law. We met for coffee, just to catch up, but the conversation drifted toward my family almost inevitably. I hadn't planned on venting, but the words poured out. The forgery, the entitled requests, the constant pressure. Daniel listened without judgment, then leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "forgery like that isn't just a family dispute. It's a crime. If he tried to move funds under your name, that could carry serious consequences. Prison time, even." The word prison lingered in my head like a bell tolling in the distance. I'd known what my uncle did was illegal, but I hadn't fully grasped the severity. I'd let it slide at the time, thinking confrontation was enough. But hearing it laid out in legal terms, from someone who understood the system, made the reality sharper. Then Daniel added something that made my pulse quicken. "If he's reckless enough to forge your signature, odds are he's been reckless in other areas too. People like that usually don't stop at one stunt." That same week, I got another piece of the puzzle. One of my newer business partners mentioned, almost in passing, that my uncle had approached him about a family investment opportunity. Apparently, my uncle had been dangling my name, claiming I was backing his ventures, using my credibility to lure in potential investors. I felt my jaw tighten as he explained. It wasn't just about money anymore. My uncle was leveraging my success as if it were his own, dragging my name into schemes I had nothing to do with. If one of those ventures collapsed, and from the sound of it, they almost certainly would, my reputation could take a hit right alongside his. That night, I sat at my desk, documents spread out in front of me, scribbling notes and connections in the margins. My uncle had debts. He had a habit of forging and exaggerating. He was using my name without consent. He was reckless. All of it was a web waiting to collapse. But here's where the real shift happened. For the first time, I had the tools to do something about it. Through my businesses, I had relationships with attorneys, accountants, even investigators. I wasn't the powerless kid being silenced at a funeral anymore. I was someone with influence, someone who could pull strings. Instead of confronting him directly, I started gathering quietly. I asked Daniel to look into some public records, deeds, liens, property holdings. I requested discreet background checks on companies my uncle claimed to be running. The picture that emerged was even worse than I imagined. Unpaid debts, defaulted loans, business registrations with no actual operations, and whispers of investors already asking questions about where their money had gone. It was almost poetic. The man who had branded me a failure was himself failing on every front. Only he didn't know I knew. The more I uncovered, the clearer my path became. I didn't have to invent a trap. He had already built one for himself. All I had to do was guide him further in, letting him believe he was in control until the moment came to pull the rug out from under him. But there was one final piece I needed before I could move forward: proximity. I had to get close enough to him again that he would drop his guard, that he'd let me see the full scope of his arrogance. And for that, I needed patience. So I accepted an invitation. It was my mother who extended it, calling one evening with that same clipped tone she always used when she was trying to guilt me. "Liam, your uncle's hosting a family barbecue next month. It would mean a lot if you came. People are still whispering about how you've been distant." Under normal circumstances, I would have declined. But this time, I agreed. When she hung up, I sat in the quiet of my townhouse, staring at the city skyline outside my window. For the first time in years, I felt calm at the thought of walking into one of those gatherings. Because now, I wasn't coming as the family failure or the reluctant provider. I was coming as someone with knowledge, leverage, and the beginnings of a plan. My uncle thought he had written the story of who I was, but he had no idea I'd picked up the pen. The day of the barbecue was hot, the kind of humid summer afternoon where the air itself feels heavy. As I drove up to my uncle's house, I couldn't help but think of how many times I'd pulled into this same driveway as a kid, always bracing myself for some offhand insult or joke at my expense. This time, though, I didn't feel small. I felt steady, focused. The yard was already packed with relatives when I arrived. Kids ran through sprinklers, adults hovered around grills and coolers, and the usual chorus of laughter rose over it all. As I stepped out of my car, heads turned. Conversations paused for a beat too long before picking back up, louder and forced. They all knew what I'd become, though not a single one would admit how badly they wanted to share in it. My uncle spotted me almost immediately. He strutted over with that fake grin plastered on his face, his arms spread as though I were some long-lost son returning home. "Liam," he boomed, "there's my boy. Knew you wouldn't let family down." I let him hug me, though every instinct in my body recoiled. His grip was tight, rehearsed, like he was trying to perform affection for the audience of cousins and aunts watching us. I pulled back, smiled politely, and handed him a small bottle of wine I'd brought, a peace offering on the surface, though really just camouflage. The afternoon unfolded predictably. My uncle held court at the center of it all, retelling embellished stories of family history, inserting himself as the hero at every turn. Every time someone asked about my work, he jumped in before I could answer, framing my success as if it were somehow his doing. "I always told Liam to keep pushing," he'd say, patting my back with just enough force to sting. He needed tough love, and look, it paid off. I nodded, smiled, let him play his part. Because what no one knew was that I hadn't come to defend myself. I had come to let him dig his own grave. After dinner, as the sun dipped and people settled into lawn chairs with drinks, my uncle pulled me aside. His voice dropped low, confidential. "Liam, I've got something big. A business opportunity. But it's family only. I want you in on it." He led me to the garage, where he had laid out glossy pamphlets and fake-looking charts across a folding table. He spoke quickly, throwing around buzzwords about real estate flips, overseas partnerships, guaranteed returns. I listened, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. Then came the hook. "Now, we'll need seed money to get started, just $100,000 or so. But with you backing us, investors will flock. This is legacy-level wealth, Liam. The family will never forget it." I studied him for a long moment. The same man who had silenced me at my grandmother's funeral, who had tried to forge my name, who had used my success like a prop in his circus. And now he was pitching me a scam he didn't realize I already had evidence of. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my tone calm. "Uncle Charles, I'll think about it. But if we're doing this right, I'll need to look at the paperwork first. Financials, registrations, all of it. You understand." He grinned, mistaking my measured words for agreement. Of course. I'll get you everything you need. You'll see it's solid." What he didn't know was that I'd already gathered most of those documents through Daniel. What he didn't know was that the investments he thought he was hiding were already on record, loans unpaid, assets overstated, liabilities buried under creative bookkeeping. What he didn't know was that by handing me his pitch, he was handing me the rope to tie the knot. Over the next few weeks, I played along. I let him send me drafts, proposals, even investor lists. Each time, I forwarded them to my lawyer and accountant. Each time, they uncovered another crack, another fabrication. By the time we were done, we had a file thicker than a phone book, proof of fraud, deception, and a trail of financial recklessness that could ruin him. And then came the moment to act. Instead of confronting him privately, I invited him to meet me in a more official setting. A quiet office downtown, neutral ground. He arrived wearing a too-tight suit and a smug grin, no doubt imagining the check I was about to write. He even brought a pen, pulling it from his jacket with a flourish as he sat across from me. I let him talk for a while, spinning his fantasies, before sliding the folder across the desk. "I think you should take a look," I said evenly. He opened it, scanned the first few pages, and his face shifted, confusion first, then irritation, then a flicker of fear. He looked up at me, his mouth tightening. "Where did you get this?" "Public record," I said calmly. "And some of it, straight from you. Your pitches, your claims. Every lie you've told investors, every debt you've hidden, it's all in there." His jaw clenched. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." I cut in, my voice sharp now. "You tried to steal from me. You used my name to prop up your scams. And you thought I'd just keep swallowing it like I always did. But here's the truth. I'm done being quiet." He leaned back, trying to recover his swagger. "So what? You'll go to the police. That'll ruin the family name. You think people will see you as some kind of hero for taking down your own blood." I held his gaze. "I don't need to go to the police. Not yet. But I do have options. Investors you scammed would love to see this. Regulators too. And if you push me again, if you so much as try to use my name one more time, I won't hesitate." For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. He tried to mask it, but his hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "You wouldn't," he muttered. I smiled, calm and deliberate. "Try me." I let him sit there in silence, the weight of his own mess pressing down on him. Then I stood, straightened my jacket, and left the room. For once, I was the one walking away, and he was the one left speechless. Fallout came faster than I expected. Within a month, whispers spread through the family like wildfire. My uncle had gone quiet, eerily quiet. The man who used to puff his chest at every gathering, who thrived on boasting about his business ventures and doling out backhanded insults, suddenly stopped showing up. Calls went unanswered. Invitations declined. When I finally heard from my cousin Ryan, his voice was low, almost embarrassed. "Dad's dealing with some financial stuff," he muttered. What he didn't say, but what I already knew, was that the walls were closing in. Investors my uncle had strung along were now demanding answers. The file I'd assembled had made its way into the right hands, not by accident, but because I quietly let it slip to one particularly furious investor who had been on the verge of suing anyway. From there, it spread. Letters from lawyers piled up at my uncle's door. The debts he had tried to hide were dragged into the open. One by one, the false fronts he'd built crumbled. The family's golden talker, the man who once silenced me at my grandmother's funeral, was suddenly the subject of hushed conversations. At the next family event I attended, Easter dinner, it was impossible to miss the shift. My uncle wasn't there. My aunt arrived alone, her smile tight, her eyes darting nervously. People avoided mentioning his name, but every silence spoke louder than words. For years, I'd been the failure in their eyes, the disappointment, the one they laughed at, silenced, mocked. But now, as I sat at the table carving ham, I felt their gazes flick toward me with something I hadn't seen before. Not pity, not scorn, respect, tinged with fear. It wasn't about the money. It was about control. For the first time, they saw I wasn't someone they could push around. I wasn't a boy swallowing his words anymore. I was a man who had taken back his voice, his power, his dignity, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The final blow came a few months later. My uncle declared bankruptcy. His businesses were dissolved, his house put up for sale, his name stained in circles where reputation was everything. He tried reaching out once, one desperate voicemail, his voice cracked, muttering something about family sticking together. I didn't return the call. I didn't need to, because the revenge wasn't in shouting him down or dragging him into court or even watching his empire fall apart. It was in the silence. The same silence he once forced on me at my grandmother's funeral now turned back on him. And as I stood on my townhouse balcony one evening, the city lights stretching out beneath me, I thought of her, my grandmother. I thought of the words I never got to speak at her funeral, the tribute I swallowed because I was told I'd embarrassed the family. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and whispered them into the night. Not for anyone else to hear, not for validation, but for me, for her. And with that, I finally felt free. The failure had become the voice. The silence had become the weapon. And the man who once thought he could bury me with words was now buried by his own. The family failure had the last word.